Stay tuned for tonight's adventure with the Fat Man.
Okay, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I hope it's good to be where you are because I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Baltimore Fats, and this is Slave City. Yeah! All right, guys, have fun. Okay, so we're finally going to close things out on the McKims in my investigation into the tableau parties that Léonce Rabien threw for the ladies in 1870-ish. By taking a closer look at the patriarchal Johns McKim, or is that patriarch, and the wealth and impact on Baltimore these two gentlemen, or the same man, may have had. And we're going to start by taking a look at Quaker John. Because when I was trying to find out anything on the Johns McKim, I came across an article from Maryland.gov regarding the industrialization of Baltimore City, right? And it reads that much credit must be given to the influence of the Quaker Miller families as they diversified their interests, developed the hydraulics, and created instruments for cooperation, right? And I love this turn of phrase, instruments for cooperation. What type of cooperation are they looking for? And what type of instruments do they need to get that cooperation? I don't know, I just love the way that reads, right? And so continuing, it says that John McKim operated the Big Steam Cotton Mill on French Street in Old Town, right? And he started the Union Manufacturing Company. And so Old Town is where the McKim School and the Friends Meeting House is. It's located down here in the southeastern corner, right? We have the McKim School and the Friends Meeting House. The Steam Cotton Mill on French Street is up here in the northwest corner, up by Jones Falls. Here's French Street. And so the interesting thing about this detail of the 1851 city plan for Old Town is that it houses districts 5 and 6, which is of course an 11, so perhaps indicating that Old Town could be its own sort of gateway. And I did find another reference to the steam mill on French Street in this book here. Picture of Baltimore, written by one Fielding Lucas. And I know I've mentioned his name in the past, and I'm sure there's going to be an episode about him somewhere down the line. But in this book, he talks about all of the industry in Baltimore. And while talking about the mills, he mentions the large steam cotton factory on French Street in Old Town for the manufacture of cotton duck. And so I'd never heard of cotton duck before, and I needed to find out what that was. Right? And so what it is it's these large rolls of industrial cotton. Right? And that have a wide range of applications. Everything from sneakers to painting canvases to tents to sandbags, but maybe even most importantly to Quaker John McKim, it's used in making sails for ships, because Quaker John McKim, if I'm not mistaken, has his own shipping company. But most interesting to me, of course, is that this is stuff used to make canvases for painting, which is amazing considering how big a part the mass production of portraits plays in the deception. Quaker John has this cotton mill, but he also starts this Union Manufacturing Company. And so, of course, I have to look into the Union Manufacturing Company, right? And it turns out that they're responsible for building one of the dams that fails during the massive and in no way predictable storm of 1866 that completely floods Baltimore, that we talked about in the Flood City episodes, right? And it says here that on documentation prepared by Paula S. Reed, and of course I have to wonder if there could be any relation to the Reeds of our story here, there are descriptions of the 1808, 1867, and 1912 dams derived from period accounts. The 1808 dam was characterized by Union Manufacturing Company President Robert McKim in his 1809 report to stockholders as constructed across the falls of the most substantial materials and completed in a manner which promises great duration, or about 60 years, as the case turns out to be. But who is this Robert McKim? Where did he come from? Right, so it turns out that Robert McKim is Quaker John's brother, right? Thomas McKim being the father of John McKim, Robert McKim. And Robert McKim is on the original charter for the Union Manufacturing Company, right, which lists 12 men. Right, it was formed in 1808, and it includes William Patterson, whom I've yet to really talk about at all in Mud City, and whose day will come, I'm sure, down the line. Right, John McKim, John Gill, another who's escaped me, Robert McKim, and down the line. Right, and I love that this is followed by the American Society for the Promotion of Domestic Manufactures and National Industry, which was organized on February 12, 1817, with Charles Ridgely, again, another person whom I've yet to really talk about at all, John E. Howard, patriarch of the Howard family and owner of Howard's Woods, and William Patterson as vice president. William Patterson pulling double duty here as serving on the board of the Union Manufacturing Company, yet also as vice president of the American Society for the Promotion of Domestic Manufacturers and National Industry. Because whose interests are really being served here? Notice that this isn't the Maryland Society for the Promotion of Domestic Manufacturers and National Industry, or the Baltimore Society, right? It's the American Society. So not only do we have Ridgely, Howard, and Patterson sitting at the highest seats of this society, right? We also have what appears to be corroboration for John McKim Jr. and Quaker John being two separate people, right? But who's this Alexander McKim over here? And so it turns out that this Alexander McKim is another brother of Quaker John, right? Comes right after Robert. So if there's one thing to be learned here, it's that the McKims like to keep all of this stuff in the family, right? Because whose interests are really being served by the American Society here? And seeing among the corresponding committee members the name James A. Buchanan makes me wonder just how far these interests could reach, because I have to wonder if this James A. Buchanan is none other than this James Buchanan, 15th President of the United States. All right, he has the pedigree. He's of Ulster Scot descent, his parents coming from Ramelton, Ireland, which is in the County Donegal. And I think it's interesting that Donegal translates as Fort of the Foreigners. Who exactly were the foreigners? And before it was County Donegal, it was known as County Tyrconnell, right? And the root Tyr is a very important part of this overarching story of Mud City. And so, of course, James Buchanan, 15th President of the United States, was also the master of Masonic Lodge 43, because of course he was, right? And this was in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where he spent most of his life, and which is only a stone's throw from Baltimore. And he has connections to Baltimore through the War of 1812, because of course he does, right? He serves in the defense of Baltimore as a private under Henry Shippen's company of volunteers. And this is very interesting because the Shippens, or some of them anyway, were loyalists, right? They were at the Mishkianza, and Henry's first cousin, Margaret, marries Benedict Arnold, right? So, and we know how all that turns out, right? So who knows who this James Buchanan was introduced to during his time in Baltimore. And so this very well could be him hobnobbing with the McKims and the Pattersons and the Howards as part of the Committee for the American Society of the Promotion of Domestic Manufacturers and National Industry. But unfortunately, I was unable to verify that President James Buchanan's middle name begins with an A in my quick search. So if anyone out there can do that for me, that would be amazing, right? And so bringing it back to the McKims in this American Society for the yada yada. And so all of this is very interesting considering where the Baron and his branch of the McKim family get some of their money. Because in 1825, the Baron becomes principal financier of the Baltimore Chemical Works, right? And so essentially what he does is he ends up pulling this chemical factory out from under this Howard Sims and puts his son in charge. And what the chemical factory does, and so this chemical factory is involved in the art or business of manufacturing and vending chemicals, medicines, paints, and various articles necessary to the useful arts. And again, here we go with the useful arts. So the Maryland Chemical Works makes paints, do they? Not paints that would be used for the painting of portraits like this one, used to mythologize the great leadership of George Washington, which could have been painted on canvas provided by his cousin at the cotton mill. And I say cousin because I just haven't been able to directly link the two Quakers other than, of course, that they're the same person through their portraits. And so who knows what kinds of suggestive waxes and oils that could have been used in the manufacture of these canvases and paints. I don't know, but if you're looking for connections to a plot that uses art to deceive, finding something like this, however circumstantial, is enough to make one's apophenia run wild. Especially when you factor in the McKims of Quaker John, right, and his father before him traced their lineage back to this John McKim, Sir John McKim of Inverness-shire, Scotland, which you may remember is the stronghold of the Clan Fraser of Lovat, from whom our McKims take their name. And so Sir John McKim was, by title anyway, a knight, making him probably one of the last of the true worm knights, a loyal servant, or he wouldn't have been awarded the knightship. And this is as far back with the McKims as I go. But that the Frasers and thus the McKims can trace their origins back to the Norman invasion, and seeing the role that the McKims may play in the psyop of the useful arts, which could possibly connect said plot to the crown, then it's hard to imagine this little investigation turning out any better. Unless, of course, you can tie it into the race-baiting propaganda that is the story of American slavery, which I can! This is unbelievable, at least in regards to what the gatekeepers want us to know about this institution of American slavery. And I just clipped this from the History Channel for a visual, but I'm sure the History Channel gives us the straight dope on this subject. They wouldn't lie about or omit elements of the story to misrepresent the events of the past to manipulate the present and the future, would they? Right? Because this part of the story really challenges what we think we know, nay, what we've been told about slavery in America. And it starts with this article that I found while digging through the mud looking for information on the McKims, entitled Industrial Slavery at the Margin, the Maryland Chemical Works. And this is a fascinating read that goes into great detail regarding the trouble that David Telfair McKim, Emily's father, had in trying to keep good workers at his chemical factory, utilizing what the narrative calls industrial slavery, as opposed to the agricultural slavery practiced in the South. All right, so at this time, in the 1820s-ish, right, the Northeast, especially in its ever-growing cities, have fully embraced the manufacturing aspect of industry, leaving the majority of the farming and so forth to the more southern states. So they needed different types of skilled workers. And since slaves were surely the cheapest form of labor at the time, it seems natural that they would use slave labor at their manufacturing plants. And so David Telfair McKim and the writer of this article blow the doors off what it could have meant to have been a slave versus a member of the working class in the 1820s in this article. Because David Telfair McKim kept notes. Lots of notes. And so before we get into this, I just want to note that while I could not find anything directly linking David Telfair McKim or his immediate family to the Quakers, considering how many of the McKims in the city are Quakers, right, it's hard to imagine that they aren't, right? And that's interesting because Quakers were well known to be abolitionists, but not all Quakers felt this way. And there are some, like David Telfair McKim, and I'm sure his father before him, who were okay with the practice. Right? And it's possible that even the abolitionist King Quaker himself, Johns Hopkins, owned slaves. And this is a hotly contested issue that really only came to light recently. And so not only do the Quakers have a complicated relationship with slavery, they apparently have one with money too. All right, Quakers and money. All right, Quakers seek a simple life because they believe in excess of possessions, or even worse, an excessive interest in possessions inhibits the awareness of God's presence. And this is really interesting, juxtaposed to some of the information in this article, published in the Friend's own journal. Quaker Money, Old Money, and White Privilege, written by this one Elizabeth Kasdan. And so in this editorial, for lack of a better word, Elizabeth goes into great detail about how old money rich and elitist the majority of Quakers are today. And this is amazing because there aren't that many of them, right? There's only about 75,000 Quakers in America today, and all of them appear to be rich. You know, I have to wonder how many of the 1% are Quakers. But I've digressed too far with this. You know, we'll get more into this when the Quakers and I tangle for real somewhere down the line. But let's get back to David Telfair McKim and his slaves and his white privilege, right? But before we do, I just want to put out there that what's to follow is merely my own open speculation and observations on slavery as it's laid out here in this article versus the mainstream narrative, which Mud City maintains is a mechanism for social control, right? And so having said that, breaking down this entire article and the concepts of industrialized versus agricultural slavery is best left for someone else. But it boils down to whether or not it was worth it for the industrialists of the North to repurpose slave labor from the type of relatively unskilled labor of plantation work to the more skilled positions of factory work. And for David Telfair McKim, the answer was yes. And so, as mentioned, his father, the Baron, once again being ahead of the curve, purchases the controlling interest in a small failing chemical factory. He puts his sons in charge and then turns the Maryland Chemical Factory Works into the Dow Chemical or DuPont of its day, a 24/7 chemical manufacturing machine. Better living through chemistry begins here. But you need relatively skilled workers. They need to be able to read and write and do basic math, as well as all the heavy lifting. You have to be able to follow a large-scale recipe. Not being able to do so can lead to disastrous consequences, like explosions and death. Right? And I know this because I spent most of my 20s working in a small family-owned chemical plant, which, believe me, at the time in the early 1990s was using hand-me-down reactors from the Maryland Chemical Works. The equipment was so old, right? But what I had to do was I had to follow large-scale 1,500-gallon reactions from the charging, which is what we called the adding of the raw materials into the reactors, through to the finished product. But it required an attention to detail. Things couldn't get too hot or cold. The measurements needed precision. Now, did you need to be a rocket scientist? No, of course not. I did it for 8 years and I barely graduated high school. But you do need some fundamental skills that only an education can provide. Whether that education is privately or institutionally gained, it doesn't matter. But if you couldn't follow instructions, you could blow the whole place to smithereens or kill everyone with toxic fumes. And I've been through a close call or two, and trust me, it's frightening, right? There's nothing like taking a bath in acetic acid to make you feel alive, right? But the point is that in order for his business to succeed, David McKim's laborers needed a basic education. So it's interesting to see how invested he becomes in slave labor. Where did these slaves get their education? And so it says that during David McKim's tenure, slaves played a key role in producing the factory's prize-winning industrial chemicals, right? They won prizes. Blue ribbon chemicals for the Maryland Chemical Works. Interplay between McKim's entrepreneurial goals in maintaining a mixed slave and free workforce and the varied objective of the slave hands illuminates with rare clarity the transmutation and adaptation of slavery at its geographic, social, and economic margin. And we're going to talk more about the transmutation and adaptation of slavery in a little bit. But getting back to it, with this big investment from his father in the chemical works, David expands the works dramatically, installing a 24-horsepower steam engine, adding new buildings, including a dwelling for the slaves, and walling in the entire plant complex. This is a huge expansion. The company really blows up because the future is going to need its chemicals, right? And so the Maryland Chemical Works goes big time here, right? And this is where the story starts to take a turn. In anticipation of the 1828 New Year slave hiring season, McKim advertised that he wanted on hire by the end of the year 10 or 15 healthful, able-bodied Negro men from 18 to 35 years of age. To orderly and well-recommended men, liberal wages will be given. Within weeks, 13 newly hired slaves were at work, swelling slave numbers to 28, or 2/5 of all manufacturing hands at the chemical works. So this makes a total of 70 employees, 42 of which would have been free hires. But what's most interesting to me, of course, is the language of David McKim's want ad. It was a hiring season. He advertised that he wanted on hire and that there would be liberal wages given. How could a slave be hired and given liberal wages? That doesn't add up. Slaves were owned and could own nothing. Yet here, David McKim is hiring them and paying them well. And so over the next 5 years, David McKim tested the feasibility of slave labor in a factory setting, carefully monitoring his labor costs and production levels and gradually reshaping his workforce accordingly. In a curiously mixed outcome, McKim diminished the proportion of slaves among his workers, but relied on those who remained to provide the skill and continuity needed for stable production of chemicals. And so essentially what he did was his own worker reaction, right? And it settled at this balance, this 2/5 to 3/5 balance. And the cream rose to the top in this labor force, right? Because he gives his most important jobs to the slaves that he kept on, right? He valued his slaves more than he did his free hires. But there's also this, which further thickens the plot, right? Perhaps the biggest incentive for acquiring slaves came from the turnover mainly exceeded 100% per year. While some turnover of unskilled laborers was expected and even welcomed, you want to get out the bad ones, hiring 2 or 3 workers per year per job must have impeded production, a problem that could be addressed by obtaining bound labor. For all these reasons, then, David McKim committed the works extensively to slave labor from 1826 through 1828. The works bought slaves, contracted with owners for the hire of others, and dealt directly with a few slaves who hired their own time. Slaves who hire their own time? How is that? Right? Slaves didn't have ownership over their own time, did they? What does this statement say about the nature of slavery and what bound labor could be if slaves could sell themselves out? because that could be quite lucrative for a slave who could hire their own time. There could be a lot of money to be made, as we'll see in a minute, because contrary to conventional thinking, slave labor was not cheap. All right, let's take a look. In 1826 through 1827, David McKim paid a below market value of $295 each for 10 slaves. He got the bundled rate, right? And that's roughly $8 or $9 grand per slave today, which again is a considerable sum of money. It's a fortune. Add on top of that what it could cost to feed, clothe, and house these slaves. You're looking at over a $300 investment per year, or $10,000 in today's money, for a worker who may not make it through the year. Contrast that with what he was paying his free workers. Free workers typically earned 75 cents a day or $4.50 a week, with overtime paid at the same rate. So $4.50 a week translates to $234 a year in the 1820s, or about $7 grand a year today. And that's about 10 to 20% less than the cost of a slave without the expense of care, food, clothing, shelter, etc. So if slaves, some of them anyway, had the right to earn outside their duties as a slave, what separates that slave from the free man other than the title of slave? In my years of doing this show, I've come across articles and stories that clearly demonstrate that the people history calls slaves had some form of independence, at least in Baltimore anyway, surrounding this industrial slavery. They clocked in and clocked out. They lived with their families and created city neighborhoods. Of course, I can't say it was like this for all slaves, but stories like this are in the record, which again contradict the mainstream slavery narrative, like the idea that slaves didn't get paid. Slaves also worked a 6-day week, but were paid money only for overtime work. Of course, because all of their other needs were taken care of. But this clearly shows that slaves were entitled to pay or compensation and could own things like money. How many times your history book tell you about the overtime pay slaves earned, or that they got sick days? Because one of the things that David Telfair McKim hated more than anything was absenteeism. His chief evaluation criteria were slave absenteeism and willingness to perform extras. One baseline against which to measure slaves was the absence rate of free white workers, which amounted to just under 1/10 of all workdays. Perhaps to McKim's surprise, the slaves missed work 9.4% of the time, virtually the same as the free laborers' rate of 9.6%. And so this is roughly 30 days a year in a 6-day work week. Can you imagine getting a job and having 30 days off right at the start? It's really amazing, right? And the fact that there was really no difference in their absenteeism, again, kind of speaks to where this is going to go. And it's yet another example of parity, or dare I say, equality between the free and bound workers. They were afforded sick days. And there is evidence that some of these sick days were discretionary, as in the account of disgruntled slave James Winder, whose 6 weeks absence was accounted for as sick or lazy. Sick or lazy. And this indicates that there was no effort to put this slave to work for 6 weeks. Where does that fit into the modern narrative on slavery? Because if it's true of one slave, it's true of the others. If they wanted or needed time off, it was granted. But 6 weeks? That's a massive part of McKim's investment not paying dividends. If he's paying $295 a slave, that's $5.67 a week if they last a year, which most of them don't. That's over $1 more per week than the average salaried free worker. $34 over the 6 weeks. And this is where we get to talk a little bit about how much money $4.50 was in 1827. I found this price guide, and we're just going to hit a couple things really quick. Half a bushel of potatoes was 20 cents in 1827. 43.5 pounds of beef at 4 cents a pound was $1.74. 7 pounds, 2 ounces of salt pork at 8 cents a pound, 57 cents. Right? Let's see what else they got in here. 4 pounds of honey, 10 cents a pound. Right? They have a gallon of cider, 20 cents. A bushel of beans was $1. Butter is actually quite expensive for what it is. 2 pounds of butter was 21 cents, and a quart of salt was 6 cents. And so now, if you wanted land in 1827, land cost, look at these prices, right? In 1820, for $1.25, you could buy 80 acres of land in America. I don't know if this is true for Baltimore City, but it's a rough estimate, right? And by 1832, $1.25 bought you 40. So we'll split the difference, and in 1827, we'll say $1.25 bought you 60 acres of land. Right? And if you wanted to put a house on that land, I found this for the 1820 to 1819 period, that using hired labor, a 2-room log house might cost $100 to build. And so we'll be generous and say that 10 years later, it cost $125 to build, 25% increase. And so at $4.50 a week, you're making $234 a year. You could buy 60 acres and pay someone to build a house on it for just over half a year's pay. That's incredible. Can you imagine being able to buy land and a house on grunt salary in less than a year? How different would all our lives be if the income to cost ratio stayed this way? And it's this question that sort of brought into focus Mud City's interpretation of what industrial slavery and David McKim's use of it really represents, which is nothing less than the creation of Gen Pop as we know it today. Industrialized slavery transmutes and adapts into the working class. This industrialized slavery appears to Mud City to be the prototype for the working class they know is coming. Right? In this system, there is very little difference between the slave and the free worker in terms of investment and productivity. And this is one aspect of the American slavery narrative that often gets overlooked in favor of the race-baiting all slaveholders were or must have been cruel people party line. Because whether free or bound, if you expected your workers to produce effectively, your cruelty could only go so far. It doesn't benefit the owner. Just how different were the slave quarters David McKim built versus whatever house or tenement the free worker was living in? It's 1827. All of these buildings are kind of the same. How much more could any of these buildings been than just 4 walls and a ceiling? The main difference being, of course, is that the free workers had to spend their money. Their income was discretionary. And I'm absolutely certain that the industrialist slave's life looked pretty good to immigrants and the indigent of the era. Right? 3 hots and a cot and pay? And this could have been very lucrative to the slave who could hire himself out or to the freed slave, of which David Telfair McKim had no problem hiring. The free blacks and the slaves hiring their own time were mainly carpenters or coopers. All right, so see, again, he rewards his better slaves with full-time work in the chemical factory. But this does indicate that Dave McKim was no racist if he would hire free blacks and slaves at the same rate that he was hiring his free white workers. And if these freed slaves were willing to sell, or in other words, contract themselves out to David Telfair McKim for 1 year, they could walk away over $330 richer if they worked every extra. And again, that was a fortune, as we've seen. And the hiring of slaves was more common in other industrial factories. David Telfair McKim was shrewd and saw the value of keeping his best working slaves in his stable, at least for a couple of years. And so to Mud City's eyes, taking the ownership, in quotes, out of the equation of industrialized labor was better for the bottom line. Because as far as industrialized slavery is concerned, it seems that ownership really only applied to the service. It was a contract. And so, as I've said, this isn't meant as a commentary on American slavery as a whole, just what's presented here. But what's presented here is a chapter of the slavery story that is sorely neglected in favor of the divisive hate rhetoric used to separate us as a mixed culture. Because a united working class would be devastating to whatever agendas our controllers may have in store, right? Like finding ways to take all that discretionary income back in the form of entertainments and the perceived benefits of their medicine and science and technology. Not to mention insurance and taxes, to which we are all slaves. Industrial slavery and David Telfair McKim's analysis of it are just among the springboards that got them there. And of course, it's the McKims' involvement in the arts, useful or otherwise, not to mention all the charity work that they do, that greatly informed this conclusion. And it's here we're going to close out our story of the McKims and of the tableau parties of 1870-ish, thrown by the ladies and Professor Rabien. And when I first learned about these tableau parties and Mrs. Jarley's waxworks, I certainly didn't anticipate the ride that it would take us on. And we've really only scratched the surface. I never even got to the waxworks itself. And so will I pick up the story here next season, or will Mud City take me in a completely new direction? I don't know yet, but I'm just as, if not more, in love with this story now than when I started. So only time will tell. And I certainly hope that those that stuck this story out with me enjoyed the ride as much as I did. I had a blast putting this season together. But we're not done yet. We have one more to go. A story so amazing, it could only be a season finale. So remember, guys, just because you don't know the truth doesn't mean you can't have fun with the lies, right? And so until the season finale, cheers.